Good evening. Welcome to the National Archives William G. McGowan Theater. I'm Miriam Kleiman, Program Director for Public Affairs here at the National Archives, and I'm thrilled that you could come join us for this very special program tonight, Music in the Life of President Lincoln. We present this program in partnership with the Virginia Chamber Orchestra and the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, and we thank them for their support. When I was asked to introduce tonight's program, I thought, oh, this is easy. I'll link it to Lincoln, I'll connect it to this week, and I'll find some cute connection to Valentine's Day. So, to link to the National Archives. For our records, here at the National Archives, we have numerous records, of course, related to President Lincoln, from his original State of the Union addresses to his presidential pardons, commissions, and endorsements. Of course, one of our true national treasures is the original Emancipation Proclamation. And you will have a rare opportunity to view this very fragile document this spring. So stay tuned, archives.gov, and we'll post as soon as the date is decided. Of course, this week is important because Lincoln's birthday was Tuesday, and many of you celebrated, I imagine. But linking this program to Valentine's Day was harder. While Lincoln is known for many things, romance didn't seem to be high on the list. And I did some research about tonight's program and learned in terms of his musical connection that he didn't play an instrument, didn't read music, and couldn't carry a tune, but I did find the obvious connection, which was he was passionate about music. Now, we are fortunate to have so many of you here today. You'll be on stage, on screen, and those of you who came out tonight to join us, many of you who are passionate about Lincoln and music. I'll start with someone who's really passionate about Lincoln. It's my pleasure to introduce John O'Brien, president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. It's our nation's oldest organization devoted to studying the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And check out their Facebook page. This is one very busy group. Though he started out in journalism, he instead became a hospital executive. But since his retirement, John's had time to pursue his true love, learning more about Lincoln's ties to those who lived and worked near the White House. He's created an incredible and beautiful Lincoln and Washington map that's in the permanent collection of our neighbors down the street, the Library of Congress. He lectures frequently and leads special tours of the places Lincoln liked to visit when he was able to get away from the executive mansion. He's truly an authority on President Lincoln in Civil War Washington. Please join me in welcoming John O'Brien.
Miriam, thank you very much. I gave Susan 2 lines. You did a lot with that. Good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, I'm delighted to be a sponsor of this delightful event for this evening. As Miriam mentioned, this is Lincoln's birthday week, and for us it continues a series of celebratory events, of which this will be the capstone. Now, I'd like to say that Lincoln had a tradition of celebrating either music and or his birthday, and in fact, we can't find much of either. There's no record at all that Lincoln ever celebrated his birthday, so I'm sure he'd be a bit embarrassed by all the attention we spent to his honoring him during this week. I hope you may be aware of the National Park Service annual birthday celebration at the Lincoln Memorial, a delightful event with military honors and wonderful speeches, which continues through this evening. Lincoln and music, even though Miriam mentions that Lincoln did not play an instrument, he did enjoy the company of a good friend of his here in D.C., Ward Hill Lamon. Ward Hill, as he called him, did sing and did play a stringed instrument and often played at Lincoln's request. And Lincoln was often moved in certain emotions, whether it be laughter or tears, by the quality of Ward Hill's presentation. So most of the music that you will hear tonight has some connection with Lincoln's enjoyment that we know from various stories of Lincoln's history. Now, the Lincoln Group has in the past, recent past, done several other events with the National Archives. We've done a Lincoln-Douglas debate, where both Lincoln debated both Stephen Douglas and recreating some of the Stephen Douglas debates, but then had a conversation with Frederick Douglass. So that all occurred on one stage here last year. And before that, we had the South Dakota, the Mount Rushmore Forum, which was all the presidents on Mount Rushmore having a wonderful conversation, led by Harold Holzer, whose book will be discussed here next month. So we are an active group. We invite you to learn more about what we do. LincolnGroup.org is our website. There is the Facebook page. And look forward to enjoying tonight's event with you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, John. To say that our next speaker is passionate about music would be an understatement. It's now my pleasure to introduce TV and radio personality and native Washingtonian, Robert Aubry Davis. He's creator and host of Millennium of Music, a program carried by more than 120 public radio stations nationwide and on Sirius XM satellite radio. He's been host and moderator of WETA TV 26, Emmy Award-winning weekly arts program Around Town since the program's inception in 1986. He's also WETA's Most Valuable Player, MVP. He is their Pledge Drive superstar. He was a founding program director of Sirius XM's classical music channel and can be heard on that channel as well. He's a frequent lecturer and commentator for arts institutions throughout DC. Basically, he's a pillar of the DC arts community, or as Washington City Paper put it, Davis has assumed sole responsibility for the cultural literacy of an entire region. As if that weren't enough, and I asked him back in the green room if he ever sleeps, he also acts in local theater, recites poetry, writes sonnets, and plays guitar. Please join me in welcoming Robert Aubry Davis.
Oh, she understates the point, but never mind. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, John. Thank you, Susan, for allowing us to have this. Some of you have actually followed us all around with the Virginia Chamber Orchestra and seen the extraordinary work that group has done to promote music of all types, but it's been sort of a fascinating thing to have this specialty about music from the time of President Lincoln, and it's been great because we, I think, as a nation, kind of undervalue our own cultural heritage. And it's been being able to focus on one great man and then the arts and music that surround him has been a grand thing. We have some fantastic people who will be talking with us all later. But this presentation, Music in the Life of President Lincoln, is designed to add kind of a new dimension if you don't know enough about this extraordinary leader. Hearing and discussing the music that lifted Lincoln's spirits and strengthened him during the challenging years of his presidency provides fresh insights and a deeper appreciation of both his character and his own leadership. We know Lincoln enjoyed a huge variety of music, including, of course, operatic works, folk songs, patriotic melodies, spirituals. At times, it provided an essential, though temporary, escape from the stress of the presidency during the Civil War years, and at other times, we do know he was moved profoundly by music. And let me kind of bring these panelists up because each of them is a specialist in some aspect of President Lincoln and music. Let's bring up John Stauffer, Benny Monkman, Christian McWhirter, and Elizabeth Brownstein. And we'll come up here and sit. You guys know where you are. Take your time. And we'll talk with them for a while, and then we'll kind of open it up to the floor, and you can ask anything you'd like to ask of anybody at any time. And John, I'm going to, you know how to sit, right? No, you know how to sit. You know where to sit is more importantly.
That's right.
There we go. Okay, there we got it.
Thank you.
We have a list. It goes by microphone. But yeah, if you don't sit by microphone, you're sunk, you know. All right. Yeah, there we go. All right, Elizabeth. There you go, dear. Got it? Here we go. Take your time. Take your time. Here we go. You're right next to me. Here we go. Well, thank you, John. My purse. Oh, wait, that's not mine. Okay. All right. Excellent. And John, since we just heard that beautiful little section, and you are such an extraordinary specialist in Battle Hymn of the Republic, I thought maybe you could talk first and tell us a little bit about Well, that defining piece, and maybe a little bit about its relationship to the end of the war and to President Lincoln himself.
Sure. The Battle Hymn of the Republic is, I think, and my co-author of the book, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, the biography, The Song That Marches On, Ben Soskus, has become America's unofficial anthem in the 20th century. It has been performed for decades by both the Republican and Democratic National Convention. It's often sung at funerals of leaders of states. Most recently, it was performed at President Obama's second inaugural. It was the finale of the 9/11 memorial tribute. The origins of Battle Hymn of the Republic are a slave spiritual from the South. "O brothers, will you meet us on Canaan's happy shore," in which the song was, we first discovered it in a hymn book, a Methodist hymn book from 1807 that was associated with a circuit riding Methodist minister, and that song was sung at camp meetings in the South. And it's, "O brothers, will you meet us? O brothers, will you meet us? O brothers, will you meet us on Canaan's happy shore?" And there are variations, "O brothers, will you meet us? O sisters, will you meet us?" That song then transfers through hymn books to the North, and Boston was one of the centers of culture, and Northerners were drawn to that song, but not knowing the African-American roots. And we know that it was an African-American hymn in the South because of some eyewitnesses describing how slaves would sing, "Okay, O brothers, will you meet us in Canaan's happy shore," in a ring shout. And the very first publication of the hymn, it's in call and response. Both of those are African traditions. It has a "Glory, Glory, Hallelujah" chorus, which is especially popular among African Americans. The upshot is it's sung by a number of Boston abolitionists, anti-slavery people, and without knowing the origins of it. And when the Civil War breaks out, the Tiger Battalion is stationed at Fort Warren, and they have some downtime. There's a number of the soldiers love to sing, and they put together a singing group. And one of the soldiers was a Scottish immigrant named John Brown. And they were familiar with "O brothers, will you meet us on Canaan's happy shore?" They knew the music, and the soldiers started ribbing this Scottish immigrant named John Brown, saying, "You're John Brown, he must be dead," because John Brown created a major catalyst for the Civil War and invading Harper's Ferry. "You're John Brown, but John Brown's dead. You must be a soul marching on." So that's one of the lines. Uh-huh. And in June of 1861, that song just acquires this kind of cultural, an extraordinary cultural power. When the 12th Massachusetts marches under review in Boston Common on their way to fight the war, they sing John Brown's Body. And John Brown's Body was actually the most popular song in the Union Army, beginning in August of 1861. It was very easy to memorize, to march to, it coincided in August of 1861 with the first Confiscation Act, which we now know is an act that essentially is an act that provides a kind of emancipation for slaves. In fact, the freedom is not listed in that act, but the message to the officers is any slave who escapes to Union lines should be effectively freed. And Julia Ward Howe, who was seen as the poetess of America, who herself was an abolitionist, her husband, Samuel Gridley Howe, was one of the secret 6 conspirators funding to John Brown's raid. She was widely known as a brilliant poet, like John Brown's Body. She went with her husband, who was head of the Sanitary Commission in 1862 to Washington, D.C., and she went with her minister, and while her husband was working at the Sanitary Commission, she witnessed the review of the troops, and there was a skirmish because some Confederates attacked, and it didn't last long, but there's the equivalent of a 19th century traffic jam. And Julia had a beautiful operatic voice, And her minister, she started singing songs, and one of them was John Brown's Body, and soldiers heard her sing and said, "Go, girl, keep going." And her minister said, "You should elevate that song." And she said, "I've often thought of doing so, but never had the inspiration." And so she went back to her hotel and went to sleep, woke up in the darkness of the night, and as she said, all 5 stanzas were already in her head. And she wrote them down. She said that essentially, I didn't write the song, God did. And it's drawn heavily from the book of Revelation. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning with his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. That imagery is directly from the book of Revelation. She knew it cold. Most Americans at the time knew, Northerners, certainly, many if not most, knew book of Revelations very well. And what's interesting is that Julia was a Unitarian, and Unitarians aren't typically known for loving the book of Revelation, and yet she did, which gives you a sense of how popular this song is. So it's published on the cover of Atlantic Monthly in February of 1862. Initially, some people thought it was a poem because the music wasn't attached to it. It soon gets circulation because of an Ohio Methodist minister who also became a chaplain in a regiment named Charles McCabe. And McCabe had an eye and an ear for music. When he first read Battle Hymn of the Republic on the cover of Atlantic Monthly, he memorized it before he sat up, memorized all 5 stanzas. And how many in this room have memorized all 5 stanzas of Battle Hymn? I didn't think so. I asked this. It's a hard song to memorize. Anyway, Charles McCabe ends up as a chaplain with the Army. He is imprisoned in Libby prison with his troops. And when they discover that the Union has been victorious at Gettysburg, he and his fellow soldiers erupt into a rousing rendition of Battle Hymn. McCabe is also an agent for the Christian Commission, which is an organization in the North whose purpose is to help improve the spiritual and physical health of soldiers. And he attends a House of Representatives meeting in 1864 in the House in which Lincoln and Vice President Hannibal Hamlin are there. And he's asked to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and McCabe has a beautiful, deep, rich baritone voice, and he sings Battle Hymn of the Republic. And when he reaches the line, the first line, or the second line of the third line, of the last stanza, as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. The House of Representatives erupted with just joy, because at this time the House was close to passing, or trying to pass rather, the 13th Amendment. And at the end of the song, Lincoln had tears in his eyes. He invited McCabe to the White House roughly a week later, and Lincoln told McCabe, all in all, the song and the singing is the best I've ever heard.
Thank you, John. Yeah, Betty, we were talking a little bit earlier about the Marine Band, but other musicians came to the White House as well, and of course the Marine Band often showed up, right?
Was the only band practically
Yeah.
that would have shown up at the White House in Lincoln's time. Before I start my comments about this, I must say that the best source for anything about music in the White House is a book by Elise Kirk, a wonderful music historian who has, her second edition of that book came out a year ago. And for any of you who are interested in any kind of music of the presidents, including President Lincoln, I suggest Elise Kirk's book. I'm not a music historian, but I'm a historian of the White House, so I will speak for Elise in a way. But the Marine Band, yes, has been there since Jefferson's time and continues today to play for official events, receptions, dinners of all sorts. In Lincoln's time, there weren't that many, there were a lot of receptions during the war, not too many state, what we think of today as state dinners, but they did perform frequently, and also during the summer months, they, at Mrs. Lincoln's suggestion, they performed concerts on the South Lawn, at least for the first year of the Lincoln administration. After the death of Willie Lincoln in 1862, they were stopped for a couple of years, and the band played in Lafayette Square, but then resumed their concerts. And there's a wonderful print of when Prince Napoleon of France came to visit, the band performing under a tent on the South Lawn. So they were very much a part of the Lincoln period.
Mm-hmm. And Christian, we actually heard a piece there commissioned by the Lincoln Library along the line. I mean, that is a place where there are other aspects of the musical life of Lincoln, both in his own lifetime, but subsequently as well, that are kind of carried on, right?
Oh yeah, that. So yeah, the piece they played there, that we played that in our Gettysburg room. And it's a very powerful piece. That's right when you get to the end of the museum, and it carries you through. And right after you exit that room, one of the interpretive labels we have right after that, we have a painting is of Lincoln's interactions with Dixie that we mentioned as well, and Lincoln's relationship. John and I obviously have in common that we've both done a lot of research on Civil War music, and I would say John Brown's Body has the most interesting story of any Civil War song, but Dixie's a close second.
Pretty interesting.
Right.
And Lincoln's relationship with Dixie and Lincoln's relationship with the genre it comes from, minstrelsy, which is a fundamentally racist genre of music, is really interesting. That Lincoln was so was such a fan of this style of music, the way he uses Dixie. He first encounters Dixie in 1860. He goes to a minstrel show in Chicago. He sees one of the initial popularizers of Dixie. It was written by Daniel Decatur Emmett in New York, but Jay Newcomb is a minstrel performer, and Lincoln happens to be in Chicago when he's in town, and he goes to his show. And one of Lincoln's buddies is with him, and he remembers this. Lincoln erupts with laughter when he hears the song, and he claps his hands. It's weird, too, because it's almost exactly the same description we later get of the way he reacts to the battle hymn when he first hears it.
That's right.
And then 5 years later, here's Lincoln on April 10th, right back from visiting Richmond, and he gives this speech. It's one of the last speeches he gives, when he makes a joke saying, that the Attorney General has said that, we've reclaimed Dixie as a prize. Now it can be a national song. And he doesn't say that explicitly, but that's obviously what he's going for. It's a joke, but he's got a real... Dixie's the symbol of the Confederacy. The Confederacy's co-opted this song and made it into their de facto national anthem. Now we're going to make it into a national song again. But there's a lot of layers there, given the kind of song Dixie is, too.
And Elizabeth, there's all those references along the line that we now know are inaccurate to Lincoln. Supposedly he played the violin, the harmonica, the Jew's harp along the line, but he didn't play any of those, did he?
No, he did not.
Yeah.
I try to visualize looking at his huge hands, how on earth he ever could have played the violin. Of course, Carl Sandburg talked about in the Prairie Years, old Abe, I think, taking out the harmonica and entertaining the room with his harmonica playing. Well, Lincoln had a harmonica. It was the Hona Company had just started producing in Europe these harmonicas, and Lincoln did have one. The only reference that I've been able to find to the fact that he actually had one was one day when he was listening to Stephen A. Douglas's big band, and Lincoln took out his harmonica, and he said, "This will have to do for my music." He loved to put down Douglas whenever he could. There's a wonderful story about Lincoln and the fiddle, actually, not the fiddle. A great white hunter came to the White House one day to see Lincoln, and he was bringing a chair made out of the horns of the animal that he had killed. And then he said, Mr. Lincoln, I have something else for you. He said, it's a fiddle that I made from the skull of my favorite mule. And he takes out this thing with the skull of the mule, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Lincoln demurs and said, well, I'm terribly sorry. I don't play the violin, but thank you very much. God knows what kind of music could have been made out of a violin made out of the skull of a mule. But in any event, no, Lincoln didn't play. The Jew's harp, I heard that, believe it or not, at the Lincoln Cottage some years ago.
Yeah.
And I've never found any references to that. But fiddle, violin, no. Harmonica, no. What was the third one? Was it Jew's harp?
And the skull, that'd be great, yeah.
Well, anyway.
Why
anyway,
not?
Neither he nor Mary played the piano, surprisingly, because she was an extremely well-educated woman for her day. I have to tell you, I'm a Mary defender, so be very, very careful about the questions that you ask me about her, because I have a lot of things to say about her that I think will really cause you to change your opinion of her as a nutcase. And a terrible woman, and her marriage to Lincoln was hell, as Herndon said. She couldn't stand Herndon because she thought, a drunk, and Mary would never allow him in her house. But anyway, there we are. Do I have a minute to say something about Lincoln's instrument, his voice?
You do, but we're going to come back to that because
Okay.
we have two things. You want to pop in, Christian, and then I got to go to Betty about the piano story.
Well, I was going to make the comment about his voice.
Okay, all right, we got to do the voice
Well,
thing, sure.
But you go first, because if you've got a chamber and I want to hear you, then I'll follow you up if it's not the same story.
I'm sure it can top this, but this is a quote from Lord Charnwood, and I was chastised some time ago because I had not read Abraham Lincoln by Lord Charnwood. Turned out my brother had a copy of the book, bless his heart, because my father was a Lincoln buff, and we sort of grew up with Lincoln. But this is what Charnwood says about Lincoln's voice. He says, his voice when he first opened his mouth surprised and jarred upon the hearers with a harsh note of curiously high pitch, but it was the sort of oddity that arrests attention, and people's attention, once caught, was apt to be held by the man's transparent earnestness. Soon, as he lost thought of himself in his subject, his voice and manner changed. Deeper notes, of which friends record the beauty, rang out. The sad eyes kindled, and the tall, gaunt figure, with the strange gesture of the long, uplifted arms, acquired even a certain majesty.
Yeah, my story's much cruder.
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
Lord Charnwood, after
Lots,
all.
yes, Lord Charnwood had a way with, and a lot of Lincoln's contemporaries commented on, well, I shouldn't say a lot, a few of Lincoln's contemporaries commented on his ability to sing. Not just his voice.
To sing.
And his inability
That's what, yeah.
to sing. It's the one instrument we all have, and apparently Lincoln's was out of tune. So the best quote on that comes from William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, who goes on to become Lincoln's first real biographer and does all this research. And he's writing to one of Lincoln's former buddies, and he's responding obviously to a question he was asked, and he goes, "Could Lincoln sing? Could a jackass whistle or sing?" And that was his response to whether Lincoln could sing or not. So it's clear that Lincoln had a horrible singing voice as well and would leave it to others. Another friend of his said Lincoln knew the songs he liked, he knew the lyrics, and he would gladly teach them to someone so they could sing it for him.
May I interject here? We heard a wonderful speaker yesterday. The Lincoln Group sponsored a talk by Kate Mazur, who's written an updated version of They Knew Lincoln. And what was I going to say?
It was a great.
Oh, the interesting thing is, she said Herndon, in his travels, talking to people who knew Lincoln and so he never spoke to any black people.
No.
Interesting. Of course, you have a phrase for people who ask you about the Sandburg biography. I think we should talk about that just a little bit because it is such a beautifully written piece of work.
Sandburg is the most beautiful biography, most beautifully written biography of Abraham Lincoln.
And one of the most beautifully written biographies of anybody.
Yes.
It's a great literary masterpiece.
But
Yes. Yes.
What he said about Lincoln playing the harmonica is made out of whole
Well,
cloth.
he was
as
a
are
mu-
many things in
But he was
Sandberg's
a
Lincoln.
music guy. He was a music collector, a folk music
Yeah.
collector.
Well, and it's not that Sandberg, like that story comes from one of Lincoln's buddies, Henry Clay, the same guy who talks about the Dixie story, so maybe that, so take that too. But Sandberg just never found a Lincoln story that he didn't believe. That was the only thing. If it would work well in a literary
That's right.
context, Sandberg ran with it.
Literary
So it's
masterpiece.
beautiful, but take it with a grain of salt.
Well, somebody once asked Lincoln, Mr. Lincoln, how much of what they say you said did you really say? And Lincoln thought of it, and he said, oh, about half.
Yeah, yeah. So, Betty, there was a piano in the White House,
There
right?
was.
Yeah.
And I, too, like Elizabeth, give Mary Todd Lincoln some credit over the years. But she did overspend the appropriated money that Congress had appropriated for objects for the White House. And she had gone to Philadelphia in the spring, late spring of 1861, primarily because the staff had... when the Lincolns came into the White House, the staff was saying how embarrassed they all were because the Prince of Wales had come in 1860 and they had no special room for him and special accoutrements for him. So she decided that she would have a state guest bedroom for a head of state that might be coming. None did, but to prepare for them, like the English country houses did for royal family. And she bought, at that time, from this dealer in Philadelphia, the bed that is today known as the Lincoln bed, and many other pieces of furniture. But at the same time, she bought a piano, a very heavy, scrolled and carved rosewood piano, which she placed in the Red Room, which was kind of the family sitting room on the state floor. And any musicians that would come to perform or to sing for the Lincolns would perform on that piano. And also, Willie and Tad took music lessons on that piano as well. The piano is now at the Chicago Historical Society.
Remember
so
who
it
the
left
maker
White
was?
House.
Do you remember
Pardon
the
me?
maker of the
I
piano?
think it was called Showmaker
Interesting.
from 1861.
But John, you were talking about how, the Atlantic Monthly published Battle Hymn, but I mean, the idea of writing a text and sitting on another piece of music was the way music was. I mean, it was really the phenomenon, our own national anthem. And after Lincoln's death, I think we alluded to this in the script, we talked about this a lot when we do our Virginia Chamber Orchestra program. There were some beautiful tributes set to popular songs. It got to be very, very popular. But I mean, while this song is important, it really was kind of a musical war in many ways, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It's a song that's one of the reasons that I think it's remained so resonant in the 20th century. It's a song that helps to clarify an us versus them. And it's because of the language of Revelation. It's a song that helps Americans see themselves and trying to fulfill what scholars have called America's civil religion. In other words, the idea that they are acting out and seeking to fulfill what they believe to be God's will for the nation. And as you all know, America, and as a modern nation, United States is by far the most religious nation in the world as a modern nation, with the possible exception of South Korea. Every other modern nation state has become very secular. And so one of the reasons why Battle Hymn continues to circulate is because of that, both the beautiful lyrics that Julia Ward-Howe extracts from the Revelation, but the way in which the song functions as a form of American civil religion.
Yeah. That's why the soldiers like it so
Exactly.
much,
That's
especially when they're
exactly
veterans,
right.
because
That's
they're
exactly right.
yeah,
That's right.
we were fighting. God was on our
That's
side, and
exactly
here's this
right. God
beautiful
is on our
song that
side.
says
Yes.
exactly,
Yes.
we're on a
That.
divine
Yes.
mission. Right?
Yes.
Speaking of divine, there's a lot of work that's been done about Lincoln's spirituality. You guys work with this in the library all the time. I mean, we know he's a spiritual person, but kind of what else was he? Do we have an answer for that? Yeah.
Mary said he was not a technical Christian.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He did say, I will join any church that has on its altar the golden rule. That was his statement.
Interesting.
But not a technical Christian, Mary, his wife, said.
What do you say to people who?
Well, to bring it back around to music, we have some folks who recall that when he was younger, at least, that he would sing hymns with his buddies, and particularly on Sundays.
Yeah.
Lincoln would get together with his buddies while the parents were off at service. They would sing hymns together, but they would also say that he would get up and sarcastically pretend to be the minister. So, so again, Lincoln, you're never going to get a clear picture from Lincoln of where he's at with his Christianity. I mean, obviously, by the time he gets to the war, he's very well versed in the Bible and these kind of things.
And when he went to the contraband camps, which were in Washington, some near the soldiers' home, he would sing hymns with the contrabands and be very moved and would weep. He wept easily, fellas.
You know, I mean, it's interesting how we talk about all these different biographies and what they mean at different times, but these are people who are part of their time. Sandberg, clearly part of his life and his tradition, and it's like we put this stamp on Lincoln whatever time we're in. I mean, we have our own time, you know what does that make sense, Betty?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, do you?
We all do that with all kinds of facts.
Well, exactly. We kind of reinterpret them and kind of look at them differently.
Well, sure, and there's also the reverse concept that, you know, we're all supposed to get, you know, you got to get right with Lincoln, right? If you're an American leader, you got to figure out where you fit with Lincoln's legacy, and you know that's been that's changed over time, and our image of Lincoln has changed over time. I mean, I like to think that it's not entirely impressionistic, that you know, Lincoln scholarship has also moved forward, and we still do manage to somehow learn more about Lincoln. There are still new things to say about Lincoln, but the Lincoln we have today is much more, you know, we're much more interested in questions about Lincoln and race, I think, than we were in the past. I think the relationship between Lincoln and Mary is getting a much more dynamic treatment now than it has in the past. So, yeah.
Lincoln and the other White House, the new book by Elizabeth Brownstein, which I'm holding up so you can all see. Yeah.
There's a chapter in there, by the way, on the Lincoln marriage. And my first entry into the field of Lincoln scholarship, if you will, I talked about the Lincoln marriage as part of my speech. And Michael Burlingame, the noted scholar, got up and before the crowd said, "Do not believe a word Mrs. Brownstein said about the Lincoln marriage. It was horrible." Well, I was somewhat intimidated because Michael Burlingame is Michael Burlingame, after all. But there is a chapter in my book on the soldier's home, Lincoln's other White House, that gives first-hand observation by the soldiers who guarded Lincoln at the Lincoln Cottage, their observations of their relationship, and General Sickles, who certainly knew from good marriage from bad. I mean, he thought the marriage was very good. So Burlingame, I think, sort of misspoke on that occasion, if not again.
I have to, it's a personal question for me, for you, Christian, that I was very attached to the poet Vachel Lindsay, who there was a time when we actually had poets in this country who traveled around and recited their poetry and had thousands of people come just like rock stars. And of course, Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight, one of the great works. Vachel Lindsay himself was from Springfield, and in fact, when he committed suicide, it was within sight of the State House. And I mean, do you follow along the subsequent clumps of the effect Lincoln had on things like the arts and music and so forth?
There's scholars who've worked on that more than I have, but absolutely. I mean, Lincoln is the kind of quintessential American. It's interesting. So I'm not from Springfield, right? No. I'm from Canada. I lived here for a little while. I lived in Alabama for a little while. Then I ended up in Springfield. So I get to kind of be an outsider in Springfield. And Lindsay is an interesting example of, I think, a common thing in Springfield, which is, you know, I said leaders have to get right with Lincoln. Anyone who lives in Springfield has to get right with Lincoln. Because Lincoln's everywhere. He's omnipresent. When I moved to Springfield, my son was about to turn 2. And I'll tell you this story about, you know, this is a quick story about just how Lincoln is everywhere in Springfield. So he was about to turn 2. We moved to Springfield. He didn't know anything about American history. All he knew was there was this guy named Lincoln, and his picture was everywhere, and everybody loved him. And so when he was like 3, I took him to the Lincoln Museum, where I worked, and I wanted to show off where I worked. And one of the first things you do there is you go to see this movie about Lincoln's life, where we have 2 shows. And at the end of the show, Lincoln, of course, gets shot in the head, right? And my son freaked out and refused to ever go back to the library again because he said, Daddy works in the sad place where Mr. Lincoln died. But yeah, I mean, Lincoln he's the quintessential American. There's more books written about him than any other American. And so poets, biographers, politicians, composers, I was just going to say musicians. Yeah, I mean, we all have to come to terms, and we keep revisiting. We get a movie on Lincoln about every, I don't know, maybe decade or so that revisits him. I mean, Americans are always going to be grappling with Lincoln. I think even more so than Washington.
Yeah, much more.
Yeah, he's just, America's always trying to figure out, who Lincoln was, what his legacy is going to be. And they were doing that when he was alive even before he was assassinated. Being assassinated only just heightened that 100 times. So go ahead.
But that's the one wrong thing about American history. In my book, I have a couple of biographies in which I try to sort of redress the balance. I mean, you've heard of Benjamin Butler, Beast Butler, and so on. I mean, I try to give an alternative, a contrarian or balanced view. I guess I'm doing the same thing with Mary Lincoln. She's been treated really so unfairly. But we mythologize too few of our heroes. I have no qualm with what we're doing with Lincoln, and I think Washington is coming into his own, I understand. There's a couple of new biographies. Grant, if you ever want to hear a fabulous speaker, go hear Charles Calhoun, who's written a new book about Grant. Well, Grant was an old drunk. I mean, he was drunk during the Civil War. Well, he wasn't. And Charles Calhoun gives a wonderful explanation of how Grant did have a little bit of difficulty with alcohol because he was skinny, he never ate, he never slept, and he couldn't hold his liquor. So I think history at this point is so much better than it used to be, really. I think we are so much more honest than we were. But do be careful of the myths. And there's always another side.
Yeah, and I would just put a word in for those people who work in this institution. This is one of the high holy places of keeping this alive. All these folks here did research in this building. And, I just think we're curiously curious about our history as a people. I'm not entirely sure. I spent a lot of time in Europe, a lot of time in other countries, and for all of them, they seem to know more about their national history than we seem to know. So I just think, the work you four have done is quite spectacular and to be honored as well. As we open the door up to all of your questions, of which I'm sure they are legion.
Can I do something first?
Sure, jump in.
Please.
Yeah, Elizabeth does that. Yeah.
Well,
she asks her own questions.
I used to be a reporter, so I used to work for Martin Agronsky, so come on, what do you expect? And Edward R. Murrow, by the way, I have to say. There's somebody here that we should recognize.
There's so many.
She was responsible for this Virginia Chamber Orchestra creating this program, videotaping this program, working with the archives to get it edited and suitable for this kind of thing. And I'm sure, I don't see her, but
she's there.
Where is Ann Sika?
She's right there.
Would she please stand?
Bravo, Ann. There we go.
She does really good. Ann is a violinist with the Chamber Orchestra, and she is one of the most determined people I've ever known. And
I do everything she says, for example. You learn this after a while.
You have to.
Yeah. Now, we're all supposed to go to these microphones on the edges to ask questions, because apparently this is going to be the #1 most viewed YouTube thing since Beyonce's most recent video. So this is why I've been guaranteed this, So wander on down to a microphone, ask a question, and don't be shy. Or if you want to just, there we go. Here's somebody doing it. I feel good about that. Don't be shy. There you got it.
For a little perspective, do you have any ideas on comparing, contrasting how the Confederacy used and Jefferson Davis used music? I'm particularly struck, I was at a exhibit right here in this building, the archives, a few years ago, and they had alternative lyrics that the South had written for a battle cry of freedom. And one of their lyrics was talking about Christianity can be used on either side. One of the lyrics for the Southern version said, "Down with the eagle, up with the cross." So there are different ways of using biblical imagery, you know, for both sides. I was just wondering if you had any perspectives to share about how the South was using music to bolster their morale.
Or if
during the war.
anybody's from Maryland, you know your own theme song, don't you? Yes, you do, yeah. Yeah, X-theme song, right, right. Yeah.
I'll chime in first because there's two questions there. One, I would be hesitant to say either government used music. Music, the idea of kind of music as propaganda was there, but it wasn't like Jefferson Davis selected Dixie. Dixie, it was played at his inauguration. It was played at events he was at, but it was almost an accident. I won't give you the whole story, but it's almost an accident that it gets played at his inauguration, then just kind of gets attached to the Confederate government. Lincoln's a little more skilled when he talks about Dixie and things like that, but these aren't being officially endorsed. But absolutely the Confederates are using music. Political music is extremely influential during the Civil War, particularly among the soldiers, and both sides kind of have two anthems they cling to. In the North, it's John Brown's Body, which becomes Battle of the Republic, and the Battle Cry of Freedom. In the South, it's Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag. The second part of your question, though, is how they're borrowing from each other. Neither side is recognizing the other's copyright laws. And so they were stealing songs from each other the whole war long. There's many pro-union versions of Dixie, for instance. I mean, it was written in the North, then the South appropriates it, then the South writes their own lyrics for it, the North writes new lyrics for it. Everyone is constantly borrowing these melodies and these themes from each other, and that Battle Cry of Freedom. What's funny about some of those Southern versions of the Northern songs, too, and the Battle Cry of Freedom is a good example, is if you look at it, and I was here for that exhibit, too, and I bought the little fridge magnet of the Battle Cry of Freedom Southern version. And it's funny because they just add a hyphen between battle and cry. So it's like they knew they didn't have to honor the copyright, but just in case, let's just add that hyphen just so it doesn't look like it's exactly the same. So yeah, a lot of that kind of stuff happened.
I'll say after the Civil War, so the Battle Hymn of the Republic becomes hugely popular in the South beginning in the 1890s. During and after Reconstruction, for a variety of reasons, Battle Hymn becomes decoupled or separated from John Brown's Body. And beginning in the 1890s and to this day, University of Georgia's fight song and anthem is Battle Hymn of the Republic. Because part of, I think, the brilliance of Julie Ward Howe's lyrics is that they're symbolic and they're abstract. The focus is God and freedom. And both sides said that they were fighting based on what they believed God wanted, and they were fighting for freedom, for Confederacy. They were fighting for freedom to live the way they wanted.
And for just a little fun piece about the extra literary nature of this, there was very little copyright protection. Publishing in Atlantic Monthly, magazines had absolute ironclad copyright protection. Novels in America were not given copyright protection. Right. Short stories were.
That's right.
The opposite in Europe. And that's why short stories evolved in the 19th century in the US and novels more in Europe. It was very hard, unless you serialized, were you in a magazine, were you able to get copyright protection? Fun fact. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Mary Lincoln was she was very well bred and well educated and had a kind of European flair and spoke French. Did she have any musical talent at all, or did she bring in musicians to the White House? And
I heard you, I think,
about Mary and musical, yeah.
Not anything that I've seen mentioned, no. That's something that perhaps should be looked into a little bit more carefully.
Well, I don't think she had a talent for playing an instrument, but she did invite singers. There was a woman here in Washington, a native Washingtonian, an opera singer, Media Blanchard, who performed in the Red Room for a small group of Mrs. Lincoln's friends. And in fact, she was supposedly the first opera singer ever to perform in the White House. And this was not a formal concert, but it was kind of a recital, more or less. But at that time, Lincoln's office was upstairs on the second floor of the White House. And he heard her voice. and came down and asked her to sing again for him. So she did have an interest in music, and the fact that she would have her children take piano lessons, I think, speaks for her interest in music as well.
Is that the occasion where Lincoln asked her to sing Listen to the Mockingbird?
I don't recall
And
the
she
exact
sang it, and
music.
everybody was in tears, Mary
Yeah.
and Abraham, and the singer realized that she had, well, you won't call it a faux pas, but it had, it really made for very, very difficult situation. And as I said before, Lincoln cried a lot. It wasn't, well, I don't think men have that attitude today, do they? But he cried. Well, I think, in fact, just reading about, generally speaking, in that era,
Yeah.
I think men were not
Men were
shy
much more open about crying.
Sentimentality was more.
Yeah.
accepted.
Yeah,
Sentimental.
sentimentality was
Yeah.
much more.
Yeah.
One other thing about Mary, one of the surviving artifacts of Mary's that's in our collection at the Presidential Library is her music box. And there's some, we don't know for sure if there was a music box in the Lincoln home. There's some that they may have had a music box in the Lincoln home. The one we have was clearly bought after the war because one of the songs in it dates to 1865. But they're all from operas. So if it was Mary's and if it was for Mary, then that was what she dug. She dug operas. I think Lincoln's tastes were much more and Mary's might have been too, but
I think he attended a lot of operas.
he did.
though.
Oh yeah.
I mean, major things like Norma and Faust and
Oh, yeah.
Daughters of
But
the
he-
Regiment, and
he
all
did-
those wonderful operas.
He did go, but I think he had an ulterior motive, and I mean, he even said so on occasion. He said, "I go because I can be quiet here, and I can be unbothered here, and I can think here. People will let me alone." Although it often happened, it seemed in those days, that he would show up somewhere, and the audience would rise and start singing the Star Spangled Banner or something. So it was very hard for him, I think, to. In fact, that's one of the things that about the Soldiers' Home that he had hoped would provide a respite for him. But I have one chapter in the book called The Embattled Retreat, because everybody, like Seward said, I go there in moonlight, daylight, twilight, anytime. And people bothered him, late at night, and he would come down. Mary would, of course, not come down, but he would come down in his nightshirt and his slippers. And in one occasion, it was a group of Englishmen who were pitifully embarrassed by the fact that they had bothered this guy, and he came down, and they talked for several hours. And this fellow, George Barrett, was deeply impressed by Lincoln and his ability to talk so brilliantly about so many things at that hour of the night when he had really been in bed.
And also, opera was not a rarefied, highbrow entertainment. It was popular entertainment,
Yeah.
the way
Well,
Shakespeare was. And it
yeah.
was not particularly for
Yeah.
one class. In fact,
Yeah.
most uniquely known.
And Lincoln's also alive at a time when those classist impressions of culture are only just beginning to form.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And during the Civil War especially, I found a lot of this in my research for my book, there's a battle being waged during the Civil War over, because all these people who are starting to develop this idea of high culture are so mad that everybody's listening to these songs like Dixie and John Brown's Body and all this, going to say these are crude songs. If you look at Lincoln's tastes in everything, but we're focusing on music tonight, Lincoln clearly had no patience, maybe even no awareness of these arguments. Lincoln was just like, yeah, sure, opera's great. I'm also going to listen to a minstrel song. I'm also going to hear this song, goofing on Irish accents. And then I'm going to listen to this sentimental song. Lincoln, I don't think, had any kind of regard for low or high culture.
That's right. There's no hierarchy.
But a
No,
lot
in
of the
his-
low culture was, of course, based on racism, and that would include the Irish. So a lot of the anti-Irish stuff and a lot of the anti-minstrel stuff was because it was a different class, and that was code for white. Yes, go ahead.
I don't want to second guess Julia Ward Howe, but the last lines have always bothered me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Wouldn't it have been better, let us live to make men free?
Well,
Was there anything in Revelations that would dictate that or something?
there are folks who agree, right?
Yes, so that's a great question. Over the past 50 years, a number of hymn books, particularly in liberal Christian churches, have changed that last line to exactly what you've said. And the reason is that Christ's death was to give everlasting life to to Christians and to his followers, and they felt uncomfortable about the willingness to sacrifice one's own life in a time of war. And what's fascinating is the shift from Howe's lyrics of that last line to, as he died to make us holy, let us live to make us free. In almost every case, they occurred during peacetime, which makes sense. And the song is sung, as Howe wrote it, in wartime much more frequently. It's a great question.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, Al?
Could you talk a bit about Lincoln's depression and whether he used like music to cope with it?
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
Yeah, about Lincoln's depression.
That's one of the main stories about Lincoln and music.
Great question.
That music was a way that Lincoln would cope with, when he was feeling down. That's one of the reasons we mentioned Ward Hill Lamon earlier, that he would get Lamon to sing for him.
And the banjo, played the banjo.
Right, and it also was reflected in his tastes. One of the styles of music that Lincoln was particularly fond of was what we call sentimental ballads. This was a broad genre of music at the time. These songs, usually without choruses, that would tell these songs, usually about separated lovers, sometimes temporarily separated lovers, where one dies at the end or both die at the end. But a lot of them, too, are about nostalgia. And Lincoln seemed to really be drawn to these songs about nostalgia. And a lot of, again, his contemporaries recall that Lincoln liked these songs. Two sources say Lincoln's favorite song was a song called 20 Years Ago. And 20 Years Ago is a song about a guy who goes back to visit where he was a child 20 years ago and notices how much everything's changed. And that you can see where that really would have resonated with Lincoln. And that's one of the songs Lincoln asked Ward Hill Lamon to sing for him, was 20 years ago.
Some of those have survived. My Darling Clementine. I mean, some of these we still know
Barbara
and sing.
Allen.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
He liked Barbara Allen.
Yeah. But I mean, that's a great question. Yes,
Hi, I'm Dr. John Willen. I'm with the Lincoln Group of D.C., and one of the things I research and lecture on is the medical aspects of the Lincoln assassination, and here's an indirect other relationship between Lincoln and music. The first doctor to take care of Lincoln in Ford's Theater was Charles Leal. Dr. Leal, as a young boy, was taken to Stephen Foster's minstrel shows by his father, also a doctor. When he was a medical student at Bellevue Hospital, a man was brought in who had wrapped his head at the Bowery Hotel, might have been drunk, and died under Dr. Leal's care, or medical student Leal's care. That was Stephen Foster. He took care of Stephen Foster when he died. Dr. Leal was the guy holding Lincoln's hand when he died. He was only 23 years old. When he was 83 years old, he attended the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin in New York at the Lillian Hall. So there's a certain other indirect connection between Lincoln and music.
That's a grand one.
That's great.
It's amazing how many things are like that. Yes,
Oh, the surgeon, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the question's for either Christian McWhirter or Elizabeth Smith Brownstein. In September 2016, I was privileged to be part of a tour of the Lincoln Heartland that the late John Iliff, John O'Brien's predecessor as president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, had organized. A highlight was a pianoforte performance in the Edwards Mansion, brother of rather than the Ninian Edwards, on the same instrument that Lincoln would have heard. I do not remember what was performed. For an antebellum home performance, what pieces would have been played?
Well, they have actually the bound. So what people would do in those days is they would buy sheet music and then they would basically bind them together, and that would be their music books, right? And that's in sheet music. That's why they were all in standard sizes. And the Edwards place actually has the bound volumes from the Edwards family. Now, one of the things about that piano is that wasn't actually the house that piano was in. It was in Ninian Edwards' house, which was elsewhere, and was where Abraham and Mary got married. But they actually have those pieces of sheet music, and the Edwardses were highfalutin. So the songs are highfalutin. They're all
Schubert and all that.
Well, yeah, they're very they're much more waltzes and mazurkas and all those kinds of things. You're not going to find Dixie or Oh Susanna in there. No.
I understand that the piano became very reasonably priced around the Civil War. And in fact, when you could walk along the street in Washington and the windows were open, you could hear people playing. And oftentimes, Washington being rather a southern sympathetic city, you'd hear Dixie and other things. But is that correct? I read somewhere that you could buy a piano in those days for $250.
Oh, yeah, but that was a lot of money.
Well, I guess, but
No, that was thousands. Yeah.
Thousands?
Yeah,
Was it?
250 then would
Really?
be the equivalent of
But
some thousands.
But it's cheaper than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
Pianos are democratized in America. Middle-class families could afford pianos. here.
Upright. These were upright pianos. This is a relatively new idea, is
Right.
making it. That's much less expensive to make an upright piano. What you see in every Western, ding, 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 with the guy in the head, the thing in his arm, very cheap piano, very cheap to make. These were not Berzendorfers and stuff.
No, but that's how the American music industry gets started in a lot of ways, because you have these pianos that people can put in their homes, and they're not just the aristocracy.
Choral music is how American music industry got started, but it's a separate conversation. Yes,
Yeah, you've spoken about all the vocal music that Lincoln liked, the songs of the day and operas and such. Is there any evidence that he enjoyed instrumental music?
Well, that's the Marine Band, right?
They had a huge repertoire.
And he's attending those on the South Lawn himself, and is part of what's maneuvering to get them to resume after Mary bans them, right?
And they still played in the park to the north, so. Yeah.
There was another musical phenomenon of that era, as I understand it, and it's called the serenade.
Oh, yeah.
The serenade. I just wish that we could really recreate that. Apparently, if good news happened or they wanted to say thank you to Lincoln for something, a group would get up, a bunch of them, and they would form a serenade, and they would go and serenade Lincoln or whatever. It was a spontaneous kind of musical outreach and thank you to people, which just sounded to me like a wonderful thing. Lincoln kind of got tired of it because he would be expected to thank you and give remarks, and he was not an extemporaneous speaker. He liked to think very carefully about what he said. In fact, an interesting quote, I have it here, at one point he said, "I would rather compose music than write the way I do." He said, "I think music can express feelings so much better than the written word." I find that an astonishing admission for somebody like Lincoln, but there it
Now,
is.
does anybody want to raise their hand and not walk to the microphone, and I'll just repeat the question? That's cheating, I know, but I'm happy to do that. Any other thought? Yes, huh?
You talked a lot about the music during the life of President Lincoln. What about after his death? Was there particular music played at his funeral or written in response to his death?
The question earlier about
this is the question what about after Lincoln's death? Was there music played at the funeral, and then subsequently pieces that were written for the president?
I'll jump on one part of that, building on the comment about Leal, where Lincoln's influence on music and his death. There are far more songs written about Lincoln in the month or two after he's assassinated than ever during his lifetime. There's this absolute flood of memorial songs, which I think, again, reflects people want to take these songs home. They all, a lot of them don't even have lyrics. They've just got a picture of our memorialized president on them, and then they would play them on the piano, and that was just a kind of ritualized mourning that people would do. I tried at one point to catalog all these, and I don't think I got them all, but in that process, there was one guy who wrote 3, just himself, that he got published through major publishers. Just this huge outpouring of sheet music, which is partially mercenary, okay, people are thinking about this, let's publish a bunch of songs about it, right? The music industry but people were buying it, and the fact that people were buying it, I think, tells you, again, the way people are interacting with music, the role music is playing in people's lives, and the role is playing in the way they're mourning Lincoln and thinking about Lincoln's death and his legacy.
Yeah. Yes, huh? She walked to the microphone.
So I can't remember when, but not too long ago, the Portrait Gallery American Art had an exhibit on the Lincoln inaugural balls, because of course it was held there. And I didn't know if you want to comment on that, because I'm thinking that at least one of the takeaways from that exhibit was that it really popularized inaugural balls.
Well, the Marine Band, what obviously it played.
Well, yeah, and I think his second inaugural ball was actually, well, his second inaugural reception was actually at the White House. It wasn't a ball at the Portrait Gallery, where the Marine Band would have played. So he would have only had one inaugural ball, ball as we think of them as today, because the one at the White House, I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people who came in 1865, but it wasn't a ball. It was more of a reception, and the Marine Band, of course, would have performed there.
And Mary invites the Marine Band to the ball in early '62 while Willie's dying, right? And that's one of the few. We've only got 3 documents where Lincoln talks about music, and one of them is he's writing the Marine Band saying, he's writing Francis Scala, right, and saying, please go see Mary. And it's for that ball,
Sousa's dad was alive and in the band then, I do believe. John Philip Sousa's father was in the band at the time.
Yes, I think that is true.
Yeah. And of course, the Sousas were all from here in the Marine barracks, and they had a huge repertoire. I mean, all the things, it wasn't just opera. As I was saying, Schubert and Schumann and Beethoven and Mozart and all this kind of thing. They knew all that kind of stuff. These serenades, trios, all that kind of thing was part of their repertoire. While Betty was mentioning Elise Kirk's fantastic book, The Great Light, not to skew us off, of course, of music in the universe of our presence was Thomas Jefferson. Never been anybody before, in the middle, or since who's even close to that. But it's wonderful to be able to kind of talk about President Lincoln at any time for any reason, and music at this time, not just for him, but for all of the people who are suffering so enormously, was so great. I want to thank this extraordinary panel, and of course, this magnificent place for allowing us to be at the archives. Thank you all very, very much.
Can I read something?
And now, ladies and gentlemen, this is Elizabeth Brownstein in her glory. Go ahead, what you got?
No, I want to send our beloved Lincoln really a message for all of us that is so relevant today. And this is what he said, his message to Congress in December 1862. We know how to save the Union. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. That's us, folks. Thank you.
Perfect ending. Thank you all. Thank you, Susan.
Great.
Okay.